this conversation has been very rich, very inspiring, and this is just right to call our next speaker for her to wrap up this very wonderful discussion. I am grateful to introduce Miss Beverly Longid. She is an Igorot from the Indigenous peoples of the Cordillera, belonging to the Bontoc Kankanay people of Alab, Bontoc, and Sagada Mountain Province here in the Philippines. She is a human rights activist, a founder of the Cordillera Human Rights Alliance, and also served as the executive director of Ginteg, Cordillera Indigenous Peoples Legal Resource Center. Currently, she is a member of the CPA Advisory Council and sits on the Regional Council. She also serves as the International Solidarity Officer of CATIBO, or the National Alliance of Indigenous Peoples Organizations here in the Philippines, and the Global Coordinator of the International Indigenous Peoples Movement for Self-Determination and Liberation. Let me call, hi Bev, and thank you for closing this wonderful discussion.
Thank you very much, Chair, for that introduction. I am also here in my capacity as a member of the Executive Council of the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact, or AIPP, which is a regional organization of Indigenous peoples organizations, communities, and mass movements in the region, working for the recognition of Indigenous peoples' rights. So I hope our participants are not tired after hearing these wonderful and great inputs from our previous speakers. And let me greet all of you. Happy good morning, good afternoon to all of you, and happy International Women's Day. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this event. I agree, and I agree with what our panels has articulated, and I think there is no need for me really to recap what they have expertly expressed. I had to make some adjustments with my closing remarks, a closing intervention after hearing their great and wonderful input. But I would like to relate my closing with this year's International Women's Day theme, break the bias. Indeed, we need to break the bias to build a world free of bias, stereotypes, and discrimination. And these are issues very close not only to Indigenous women or to women in general who experience this on a daily basis. However, we also need to break the silence, to break the bias. And we can break the silence and the bias by having empowered women leaders in government, in trade and industry, and in civil society. We need women who are articulate, we need women who are critical, and we need women who are not afraid to ask questions and to seek answers. And empowerment comes from continuous understanding the link of the various issues that Nadia, Pratima, and Judy and Vanasi have already discussed. And this would also involve a deeper understanding of the roots of these concerns. I've heard our speakers speak of climate imperialism. We also need, of course, to know the role of colonialism and occupation in the issue of climate change. However, I think we can only have women's leadership and representation and build our capacity as women if there is women's recognition of our existence, if there is recognition that we are human beings, if there is recognition that we are part of society. And this we need to assert and fight for. I mean, things do not happen like magic, wherein we have a fairy godmother, like by a wish of the wand, Viola, we are all equal, there's no more discrimination. I mean, it does not also simply fall from the sky. And of course, with awareness comes power. Women can and should contribute to development, and as such, women can effect genuine social change. We need to enhance our skills as leaders, as public speakers, and representatives of our families, of our organizations and communities. And we do this, we do all of this with our feet firmly on the ground. I've heard in many occasions of partnerships, collaborations, cooperation, multi-stakeholder, etc. But getting people to work together towards a common vision, mission, goal, as NGOs or other civil society would say, is never easy. And a partnership or cooperation or collaboration is actually very daunting, especially when we have diverse and competing interests, perspectives, and values at stake. And we see this in the issue of climate change. The issues, the interests are so polarized. Of course, there are also different organizational and cultural contexts that are also involved, especially for indigenous, in the case of indigenous peoples, more so for indigenous women. So partnerships and collaboration is not as simple as just putting people in a room and hoping or praying for the best. And it is not easy as making pancakes. So let me outline some of the points I think that we need when we speak of partnerships that work for indigenous women, and what do you think we should do to strengthen these partnerships? One, a clear basis of unity. Why are we working together? Let us work on our commonalities, and we iron out our differences along the way. But then we always, as a matter of principle, give priority to issues of from the ground, from those who are vulnerable, those who are in the margins. Two, we should be able to identify who our friends are and who our enemies are. Who are the champions of women's rights? Who are the champions of indigenous women's rights? And our friends may not necessarily be women. No? And three, we also choose our battles. We know when to attack and we know when to lay back. Judy has been speaking on the case of the Philippines in relation to militarization. And through the years, many indigenous communities in the Philippines, when their communities are heavily militarized, it's not now a question of simply fighting militarization, but they have also learned to fight by way of collectively, evacuating from these communities so that they deny the government or the state, the opportunity to militarize their communities. And of course, fourth, we've seen the last video is the issue, the aspect of effective communication. And this should be clear and precise messaging. It's not simply a question of using local language, translating this into a language that's understood by indigenous communities, but also doing away with technocrat jargon, techno-speak, because these are things that are not easily understood by people in the ground. Fifth will be the issue of the aspect of collaborative leadership, the assertion that we, our organizations and communities are partners, and that we have something to contribute, that we are also development actors or agents of change in our own right. And I think the last, when I speak of partnership, would be participatory learning. And when we speak of participatory learning, it also involves forwarding viable and sustainable solutions and alternatives that involves indigenous women, ease the burden on indigenous women, alternatives and solutions that are not destructive, and make use of local resources. So aside from those that we mentioned earlier, those that our panel has mentioned earlier on women's recognition, empowerment, and capacity building, addressing and integrating women, climate change, and social issues is highly worthwhile. But it is also a long and sometimes really it's a very challenging process that entails patience. And this is crucial that we are able to allocate enough time and space for this. And allow me to, a few more minutes to speak on this. One, for governments, for corporations, and other multi-stakeholder mechanism, listen, no? Listen and work with us, no? Don't be afraid, no? Indigenous women, we are assertive, but definitely we don't bite, no? And when we speak of working and listening, we should be able to prioritize rural women, peasants, working women, women with disabilities, the young women. And there is so much that we can teach. And of course, there's also much that we are willing to learn. And two, with our participation, with our contribution, let us create and provide equal opportunities in structures and organizations with the necessary related policies. The absence sometimes of rules, of regulations, or guidelines might prevent equal participation of women, of Indigenous women, and they might be able to contribute to the failure to address these women issues, or probably it might also lead to further inequalities. So an example of this, many of you have spoken about it, will be institutionalizing women's rights education for all, not only for women, but also for men. And gender should be made an integral part, no, of all of our work. I mean, especially for donors, we should, I think, be part of a funding criteria or even with contracts. In the last COP26, we've heard of the pledge of governments to Indigenous peoples and local communities, a pledge of fund. You know, we welcome this, but at the same time, let us also be wary or vigilant on where the funds go, because we hope that these funds would go directly to Indigenous peoples and local communities rather than going to big NGOs who probably would be peddle false solutions like the so-called, these controversial nature-based solutions or community-based solutions. Three, in our narratives, in our conversations, let us mainstream women and Indigenous women. You know, when we mainstream women, the issue of women, the issue of Indigenous women, this would offer a lot of tools and approaches on how do we look at the issue of climate change, on how do we look at the issue of land, how do we look at the issue of and plunder. And with the participation and contribution of Indigenous women, we might be able to understand more these intersecting, interrelated issues of women, health, and peace. And of course, how are we able to address the issues of militarization and human rights violation? You know, so how do, my last point, coming to my last point, so what kind of empowerment, what kind of equality are we wanting or fighting for? And I think when we speak of equality, when we speak of empowerment, this should go beyond what we want and what we dream, but also what we should be fighting and what we are willing to fight for. You know, for Indigenous women, our fight for empowerment and equality is part of our is part of the Indigenous people's fight for to defend our lands, to assert our identity and ways of life, and for self-determination. And in all of this, of course, we need to be clear to whom do we accept accountability. In the Philippines, we have activists would have this calling of how do we address this? And we do this by what we say AOM, or to arouse, organize, and mobilize. And as a matter of priority and as a matter of principle, we do this with communities on the ground, especially with Indigenous peoples and Indigenous women. But you know, it is not easy. To fight is not easy. Therefore, we need more friends. We need more allies. And this is where solidarity comes from. We need to forge and build and strengthen solidarity between us Indigenous people, between us Indigenous women. At the same time, we also need to forge, build, and strengthen solidarity among Indigenous peoples and other oppressed and exploited groups in society. Last but not the least, as Indigenous women and advocates for Indigenous women's rights, our work also should be to expose women who speak of equality but uphold tyranny, of women who speak of empowerment but uphold dictatorships and fascism. We should be able to condemn women who support and allow the violation of people's rights. Women who exploit and oppress, are not women, but are also tyrants, dictators, and fascists. So again, let us break the bias, let us break the silence. Thank you for inviting me to this timely event, and a very good afternoon to all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Beverly, for the very powerful closing.